Van Miheil continued. Unexpectedly, we turned into a narrow, unimproved road leading around the base of a very steep hill, and were told that our destination had been reached. It was hard to realize, as there was not a sign of enemy activity. For 5 hours we had waited while F and D batteries hauled their guns up into position, driving and shouting, pulling and yelling in a vain endeavor to urge tired horses and hungry men up that hill. Dawn broke. We were told to camouflage our guns at once, anywhere, anyhow. We were in the center of an open field, and as we could not go to the woods, we brought the woods to us, and soon had planted trees and brush around our guns in an irregular line across the field. I have wondered what a puzzled German observer thought at this unexpected forest growth overnight, but evidently he did not see it or did not care. He took our horses and caissons back into a damp, soggy, thick wood crowning a long ridge, but we found no rest for the weary. Ammunition must be hauled, thousands of rounds of it, all that night until daybreak. The next morning, in desperation, we set out for the guns, tore down our improvised forest, and hauled and shouted and pushed these guns uphill. 16 horses to a gun and every man on the wheel. We got there by a flying start formation conceived by Lieutenant Davis and additional impelling power furnished in no small measure by the blue-flamed language from the lips of Sergeant Winthrop. We went into position just under the brow of the hill, facing a line of reserve trenches from which the wondering doughboys cussed us for our exposure and activity. Thousands of rounds of ammunition we water haul to our position before dawn. All night we worked like ants, building grain by grain the hill of shells. Our horses dropped from sheer fatigue. Men disappeared as before in the dark to show themselves exhausted on the ground. Preliminary fire began at midnight, September the 11th. 0 hour was at 5:30 a.m. and the ammunition was coming in driblets. Vigilant guards had to watch the precious pile, fearing a raid by a neighboring battery. We had had no rest for 60 hours when we opened up with our preparation fire at midnight. At 5:30 a.m., the surrounding country lit up as if by magic. Every square yard of ground seemed to contain its gun. The noise rolled in unbroken sequence. It almost made the heart stop in sheer amazement. The rate of fire was fast. We were on a barrage line, too fast, and the guns soon were overheated, so we had to cool them off by stopping and putting water rags on them, and then burst forth again with renewed vigor. The flashes momentarily revealed men running, digging, and staggering under a load of shells, all bent on feeding the hungry guns. The sun rose, disclosing 3 lines of guns, almost hub to hub, stretching as far as the eye could see, north and south. Fresh life came with the dawn, and hot coffee made us new again. We had had no reply from the enemy. It all seemed unreal until slowly down the hill a ragged column of men appeared and shuffling in their gait moved towards us. We eagerly watched their approach. Prisoners, hundreds of them, cut off by our barrage. The sight of them revived us like wine. Hurried orders to advance were received, and soon we were on our way again to press forward over the shell-torn roads which we ourselves had made a few hours before. The regiment had fired 2,000 rounds, I would suppose, and the rest of the ammunition which we had piled up unnecessarily was left there. And to me, they represented the gravestone of many horses dead or which died later from those 2 harrowing days of preparation. Our horses were now well reduced, and soon we saw the quads coming along to take their places. I purposely dwelt on this barrage because it was in point of artillery engaged and ammunition expended the most stupendous in our military history, except later on during the Argonne offensive. It was September 12th, but warm as a summer day. Our way led through Miheil, crossed a no-man's land which had existed for 4 years. We encountered signs of a sudden German exit in the quantity of abandoned personal effects, maps, field glasses, letters, books, and so forth. It also finally found a kitchen with a cache of potatoes still warm. However, we were not tempted as they appeared. We feared not to touch them for fear of poisoning. We halted near Dummartin, and laid on a protective barrage line. There was no firing except by Lieutenant Albro, who had gone forward with the infantry with a pirate gun and was amusing himself by firing at an observation balloon miles out of his range, but a luring target. That night we slept under a full moon. It was a wonderfully peaceful night, and it was hard to realize that 24 hours before the enemy was withdrawing over this ground in the face of our heavy advancing barrage. For hours I lay awake, thinking of the contrast of war and the sudden changes that follow suddenly in its trail. The reaction of the previous day set in, and on every hand there was manifest a new spirit of comradeship, fostered by mutual dangers, suffered and overcome. Victory is sweet. On the next day, we retraced our steps to Rupt-on-Wur, where we took stock of our horses. It was a sad inventory, but the success of our efforts compensated us for their loss. The work had been too severe for these soft French horses whose former life had been spent lazily pulling plows through yielding rich soil or hauling the market wagon a few miles to the railroad. There had been practically no return fire from the enemy during the 3 days that we were there. It's hard to believe that the Germans did not know the offensive was coming and had prepared to flatten out the line. A lone shell on our left, where our sister regiment, the 16th Field Artillery, was in position, had made a direct hit on the shelter occupied by Bill Macilas, Williams, 1917, and he died a hero's death in this action. Our sojourn in Rupt-on-Wur was short but active. We had only begun to fight now, and rumor of a drive of vast proportions spurred us on to clean up and get ready. September the 20th, I was detailed to go forward and locate a new position near Esney on the slope of Hill 304, adjoining Le Morton of Verdun fame. I had always wanted to see this hill, but was not over anxious to visit it right away. But seeing that my friends at GHQ were so insistent, I started out with several other officers in a bouncing, smelling, springless quad, and pulled my tin hat a little further down over my ears. There was seemed to be too much exposure at the nape of my neck. Arriving at Montville, our driver politely informed us that he was going no further. We detrained for a cross-country walk in the direction of the least barbed wire and the biggest shell hole. The road we shunned as a leper. A big shell hole, always at hand, was a comfortable thing to feel, even though it was half full of stagnant water. An impromptu plunge is often unavoidable when a whining shell supplies the impetus. We did not pick out our position. Somebody at brigade headquarters had been kind enough to do that for us. We only went to see how lucky or unlucky we had been. The position picked out for us had to be approached from the road across a 8 or 10 foot trench. So ramps had to be built. For contrary to the hazy thinking of brigade's operation officers, guns do not jump. I often wondered how he had missed putting us in the trench. We returned to Rupt-on-Wur with glowing accounts, glowing with profanity, of our new position. And on September the 22nd, we set out for the sector, which was to be our home for 46 consecutive days until the armistice of November the 11th. We had a feeling that the climax of our service was approaching. It was to be the supreme effort, and we guided ourselves accordingly. Only bare necessities were carried. We were to engage in a war of movement once the enemy had been dislodged from their positions along the so-called Hindenburg Line, which encircled Verdun like a steel band. Sam Miheil had been a surprise party, and like a surprise party, it was over quickly. We had arrived for a long visit. The Meuse Argonne. On the night of the 24th, we went into position northeast of Esny, negotiating the trench difficulty by means of our ramps braced on ammunition boxes piled in the trenches. All day of the 25th was devoted to checking and rechecking the data for the morning's creeping barrage. Behind us was visible the Esny-Montseville road, which for a distance of 200 yards over the summit of Hill 298 was under direct observation by the enemy. This section was under a sharp sniping fire by a Boche heavy, and we watched breathlessly the battle of wits between the gun and the numerous trucks and staff cars which poured over this road all day. Only one vehicle was hit, an ambulance, which fortunately was empty. Zero hour was 5:30, September the 26th, and again the entrancing enormity of the operation almost paralyzed the beholder. Our own regiment, each battery visible to the other, fired each shot as much in uniform as possible on a signal, following my signal on the flank. Every square yard belched forth a flame, and sparks whirled in the heavy mist of the morning. I was on the extreme right and stood on an improvised shelf constructed on the side of a immense bomb hole. The rate of fire was spasmodic, and we had to cool the guns at intervals by pouring water on them or saddling them barrels in damp floors. We fired steadily for almost 3 hours, our final range being 6,000 meters. I believe we started somewhere around 3,200 meters. The mist and the gun smoke lifted simultaneously at about 9 o'clock, and we dragged our guns back onto the road and hitched up for the advance. We knew the attack had been successful from the number of prisoners brought back. These prisoners carrying on stretchers our own wounded, so releasing men for active combat. We pushed on that day about 7 kilometers when we were finally halted somewhere between Bethencourt and Montfaucon by the crossfire of a hostile machine gun, which the infantry in the hurry of their advance had either overlooked or left for someone else to attend to. It was too late to do anything about it, and so we were forced to spend the night behind the bend of the road, sleeping under our carriages in a penetrating drizzle. The next day we crisscrossed countrywide to Bethencourt. Our 2 ramps, which we had religiously carried with us, proved their worth over and over again across this honeycombed hill. We fired another creeping barrage on the 27th and then made a hasty move to Sepsarge, where we settled down to a real visit. Here we witnessed many aerial combats. No experience I have ever gone through has quite thrilled me as these air duels, especially when a number of machines were engaged, and it became a finished fight. In spite of persistent warnings, we could not keep our men under cover, and they bobbed up, yelling encouragement in the same words and phrases as one hears at a college football game or a big league baseball contest. It was almost impossible to identify the planes, and the proud possessor of a field glass was beset by numerous satellites begging for a look or asking countless questions. On October the 3rd, we moved ahead to the Bois de la Sepsarge, where the day before F Battery had been shelled out of position, and where its brave captain Charles B. Duncan had received a mortal wound. Captain Duncan was undoubtedly by the most beloved officer in the battery, and subsequently, when I was in command of F Battery, I was daily reminded of the love which the men had for him, and it was a difficult position for me to fill after such a leader. Here we were close to the enemy lines and in the midst of our own infantry, much to their disgust, for our activity was soon noted and drew a considerable response in the shape of some heavy, very wicked sounding 210s. I never was proficient at water sports, but when the first one struck not far away, I made a pretty dive down into a deep dugout as one could wish to see, and just scraped through the door with a slight rent on the sleeve of my arm from a projecting nail. Near our position was the temporary burial trench, and in awed silence we watched them brought from the dressing stations nearby on the woods in the front, and wrapped in their own blankets laid gently away in the long rows. This was only their temporary home. They slept close beside each other in their final sleep, made brothers by their sacrifice. The farmer boy from Michigan and the counting room clerk from New York. We added one before we left, Private Carnes, hit by a shell fragment as he walked his post of duty. His loss was a heavy one, for he, never failing humor under all circumstances, had been a big factor in keeping up the morale. I would rather have one such man who could arouse a laugh or force a smile when anyone was in the dumps, worn out by fatigue or unstrung from enemy fire, than the four best gunners in the army. Such a man was Carnes. We fell back to a new position near our old one at Sepsarge to find our former position completely demolished by enemy fire. They told me this had happened the day after we left. 2 men had been killed in the little shelter I had built and occupied. On the way back, the captain had asked his striker to hang his stove, which he always carried with him, slung over one of the gun barrels. it disappeared in the course of the dark night. Nobody knew how, and the captain was more upset by that than anything else that could have happened. In fact, it made him sick, so that I was forced to compute the firing data as well as fire it for a week. Our infantry had been withdrawn, and we moved to the west in support of the 5th Division at Nantelwar. Our 6 horses were, our stay here was uneventful except for a machine gun target which number 1 gun destroyed in 10 minutes by some remarkable firing. The order from the observer was that to fire at as many rounds as possible at the last range. We fired about 100 rounds, I guess, in the 5-10 minutes, and then the order came back from the observer to cease fire. Fine work, alles kaputt. Our fire here was mostly harassing fire, usually at night on fixed positions like crossroads, hoping to catch ammunition trains or other people moving up at night. We had a barrage line every night, but the movement here had been halted for a while. Most of the activity was further to the west. It was here that I was informed by Major Strom that my name had been forwarded to GHQ with a recommendation for promotion. This spurred me to better efforts, for there is nothing so conducive to obtaining a good result than the knowledge that your efforts are appreciated. We had now been in the lines about 1 month steadily, and orders to withdraw for a 5-day rest came as a godsend. On October 25th, I was fortunate enough to obtain a 5-day leave to Paris, where, together with Parker Tenney, we divided our time equally between a porcelain bathtub and a feather bed. Anyway, it felt like feathers, and 3 square meals a day, with napkins and everything. The University Union near the Louvre was the clearinghouse for information as to the United States Army, and with misgivings I went to the Williams desk to learn of my friends. As I had feared, Lumpwood had made the supreme sacrifice, down by a machine gun bullet while leading his men on July the 18th on the charge. No finer officer or gentleman ever breathed. Norm Du Bois, whose sunny nature had kept us in good humor at Plattsburgh, had also gone west, blown to pieces by a direct hit from a searching heavy, while warning his men to take cover. While in Paris, I visited Aunt Ella Heitkamp and Mary. Eleanor was engaged in war work at Tours. They extended a warm welcome to their American cousin. Unfortunately, my stay in Paris was only about 3 days, because it was cut short by a telegram from the colonel to join your command at once. So off we went for the front to take part in the new push, which was destined to be the last. This account is continued on the other side of this cassette. Truck driver would stop at the top of the hill, and we were conveyed by truck from brigade headquarters to our position, but had no gas mask, which gave us cause for alarm because there were gas alarms all through the valley. The truck driver would start the truck at the top of the hill, accelerate its pace, go up to the bottom of the valley and ascend the next hill, while we held handkerchiefs with urine over our noses. There were a great many cries of alarms of gas, which was wolf, wolf, but when the real gas did come, it caught most of the soldiers unprepared. The soldiers did not give much credence to a wound stripe from gas, because it could have been avoided if the soldiers were willing to put on their masks. I found my battery at midnight, October the 31st, near Cunel and the famed farm de Madeleine, and prepared for the opening of barrage the next day, which was to start the push. The enemy was retiring quickly, although in good order, and we pressed him closely, staying only 24 hours in a position before we lost our range. On November 8th, we crossed the Meuse at Dun-sur-Meuse, and wandered our way through the Wouve Valley to Brandyville. Here we fired our last shot of the war on the night of November 10th. We received orders to move back and rejoin our division at Lucy, many miles to the south, where a new drive was being planned for the 16th. There was one a straw of hope, an armistice, rumors of which had been spreading for some time. That night of the 10th, we recrossed the Meuse at Clary-le-Grand and camped there for the night. The next day, November the 11th, we wandered about in no particular formation, just waiting for the news. Sometime in the morning or maybe afternoon, the colonel appeared and nodded his head. That's all we needed. It meant that we had fired our last shot and the war was over for us. Contrary to expectations, there was no loud cheering or horseplay. Men were too relieved. They shook his hands, some embraced with tears, and most of them just wandered about aimlessly, lay down under the trees without fear of enemy fire now, no camouflage. Some of them took their tin hats and threw them away, landing in the latrines, but I told them to take them back, clean them up, and put them on again, because we were soldiers, even though the war was over. That night we left under orders to rejoin our division in the Commercy area. Our horses were gone, only 8 left in the battery, so we departed in the quad trucks, our route running parallel to the front, which was ablaze with rockets and flares, which burst out to reveal not to reveal a hidden foe, but to proclaim peace on earth again. The ride of November 11th was one I can vividly recall. "Fini la guerre," we shouted to the passing Frenchman, and he raised his hands in eloquent gesture and replied, "Hooray, hooray." Apparently that was all the English they knew, but it answered the purpose very well. Our period of combat service was over. We had been engaged a total of 46 days on 3 fronts and had encountered almost unsurmountable obstacles such as short rations, lack of equipment, road halts in dangerous places for hours, night movements, the digging in on all occasions, conflicting orders, cooties and mud, and more mud. In desperation, safeguards were sometimes disregarded. In our position near Cunel, number 1 gun crew built a bonfire at night in order to read their instruments during firing. The firing lights had long since become useless. I could not discipline the men, for I too understood, having undergone their hardships. What do you think this is? I shouted. The Civil War? Well, it eased the situation, and the fire went out. We no longer became a target for a prowling bomber. And now the present was changed for the future. For in war, we live in the present, and in peace, we live in the future. What next was the question we discussed in our long ride south. An army of picked divisions for Germany was announced. That means us, said one cannoneer, and he was right. The 4th was chosen, and soon we were settled in the little town of Pont-sur-Meuse for a grand polishing up for the parade to the Rhine. It was to be a spick and span affair, band playing, horses prancing, banners streaming, and brave generals dashing by in limousines. To most of us, it was now given to look on the practical side of life. It meant just 200 kilometers of hiking, most of it uphill, the majority of us on foot, and all of us in full pack. And we were not over-enthusiastic, band banners and gold laces to the contrary notwithstanding. While everyone expressed his utter disgust for any grandstand effects, expostulating that he was a fighting man and so forth, I noticed his back straightened, his chin drew in, and a sparkle in his eye as we marched through on the first village in Lorraine to the tune of Over There, amidst the gaze of German sympathizers from behind closed windows and the joyful acclamation of the redeemed children of France who lined the streets, waving the little tricolor which they had kept hidden in the cellar these 40 years. The march to the Rhine. Pont-sur-Meuse will never receive the Legion of Honor. It probably will never occupy an important place in the official records of the Great War. Its people are undoubtedly still leading their frugal, uneventful lives, sans movies, sans plumbing, and with a full equipment of manure piles in the courtyard. To me, it will always remain a memorable spot, for here, on November 21st, I received my commission as a captain of field artillery, dated the 13th day of November. Not such an unlucky day after all. On the 23rd, I assumed command of Battery F just 30 minutes before we pulled out for our 200-kilometer hike to somewhere on the Rhine. Battery F had suffered since the death of Captain Duncan because of many changes in its commanding officer. Its morale was at a low ebb. To me, and my opinion was forcibly seconded by innumerable conduct of the March inspectors who hung like avenging angels on our tail. It appeared more like Coxey's army than a veteran organization of regular troops. It was an added difficulty to have to whip the battery into shape during the hardships of a long march. But I found myself in a trying situation. The spirit engendered by Captain Duncan, however, was still existent, slumbering, but still alive. It awakened and rose to the situation. In the conclusion of the march, we took second place to none in appearance and march discipline. The first 2 days of the march led through the devastated district around Mount Sec, Vignères, and Haddonville. Gradually, we entered into the open country with no signs of the war, except a few bombs which had been dropped as calling cards by our bombers on their way and return from Metz. A vista of perfect peace broke upon us as we reached the Moselle, swung into a majestic curve beneath the vine-clad hills terraced along its side, and we stopped to gaze at this opposite bank of the with mingled feelings. There lay Germany. In a few minutes, we descended the slope, crossed the bridge, and set foot on enemy soil on December the 3rd, 1918. We had spent Thanksgiving Day at Ersinger, Lorraine, where we were royally entertained by der Kleine Mike, Zymot, fashionable tailor, who regaled us with stories of previous experiences with Americans who had visited them hurriedly at night and left only a few tons of TNT as calling cards. Mrs. Zymot spread us a real Thanksgiving dinner consisting of roast pig with the inevitable apple in his mouth, cauliflower, potatoes, and cake. The men of the battery, through the energies of the mess sergeant, who had raided the marketplace with a pocket full of new, crisp 5-franc notes and a goodly supply of laundry soap, which possessed more buying power than gold, feasted on roast goose with apple stuffing. We were much amused here to behold the numerous parades of spasmodic origin led by an improvised brass band and composed of the good people of Ersinger, who vociferously sang repeatedly without signs of fatigue in unintelligible French, the Marseillaise. Well, I do not doubt that this sudden transition into French subjects was welcome. I do feel that it mattered very little to them who collected their taxes or called them for military service. Like chameleons, they could adapt themselves equally well to the French Chanticleer or the Prussian Eagle. Here I beheld evidence of the German policy of nationalization over the last 50 years. The French titles to paintings and pictures had been removed, and the paintings on the Gasthaus walls hung there without titles. We were met on every hand by the most obsequious hospitality. A well-organized propaganda was evident. On arrival in a town at night, our host or hostess would invariably have a hot meal prepared for us, warm water to wash in, and the finest white sheets for our beds. During the course of the evening, we were informed that they were so happy that it was the Americans who were to occupy their zone instead of the French or the British. This propaganda took a visible effect, especially on the less educated soldier, and we were we were forced to resort to counter propaganda and strict enforcement of the so-called non-fraternizing regulations, which prohibited the soldier from having any communications whatever with the people. But of course, this was an impossibility. Battery F was the Gray Horse Battery. All our horses, except the battery commander and the battery commander's detail, were grays, and they of course are a horse that is a quiet by nature. They bore up wonderfully well during the march, and we only lost one, and that was from a broken leg. Wild Bill Rogers of Battery E one morning dug a pit and left therein a horse which he said had died from sand poisoning. However, it wasn't a half an hour later than that same horse had been resurrected and was led away, looking quite sound, by some of the native residents. Joe, however, merely uttered a few epithets and said, well, if he wants to work with those damn Dutchmen, why, that's his lookout. We recrossed the Moselle to the west bank again at Trier, just north of Cochem, and skated through this historic old fortified town and climbed the steep mountains inland. December the 19th, we marched into Kaiser's Esch and beheld our winter home. A group of about 300 plaster and timber buildings situated on the main road to Koblenz. It was inhabited principally by farmers, although there was a cigar factory and a quarry in the as the two industries, except for continually nagging by the staffed officers encountered as several who counted it a severe crime to find a feed bag folded the wrong way, or a hook unbuttoned, or someone marching falling out on the wrong side of the road. The march had been an uneventful one, for one incident in which I was involved, and that was one of my men at noon halt had fallen out on the left-hand side of the road, I suppose looking for something there that he saw, and before he could get back, why, one of the line officers had sent word that the regimental commander, Captain Major General Hersey, wanted to see me. When I reported, why, he looked at me quite severely and told me that my march discipline had not lived up to the best traditions of the division, and encountered the incident. Sitting beside him, however, was my old friend Bummy Mickler, Williams 1915, who had been his aide, who was his aide, and he gave me a kind of a sly wink. Well, anyway, I received no punishment. My record, Ebony, having helped me, but I was given to understand that some of the officers were sent to Blois, that is a place for reassignment, for less breaches of march discipline than the one that I had been charged with. We were able to billet 3 regiments in Kaiser. I in the home of the owner of the cigar factory, and my bedroom on the second floor had a balcony outside from which I could look up and down the street and keep my eye open. I was often tempted to take reveille from this balcony, just throwing a jacket over my pajamas, but I never yielded to that temptation. New problems arose: fraternizing, light beers and wines, YMCA, we want to go home, and so forth. And thus we settled down to our winter in Germany. 7 months in Germany. The slogan for our sojourn in Germany was "Keep busy." The forces of reaction from the strain of active service, the champing unrest engendered by the wait to go home, and the natural dislike for the German populace, the dangers of a adequate and cheap liquor supply were all problems which must be met by the policy of keeping busy. Therefore, we had regular drills in the morning, schools at night, organizing athletics, a Y hut, a short and long leaves to France, trips up the Rhine, inter-battery and inter-regimental contests of every nature, all with the purpose of keeping up morale. First Lieutenant A. Gordon Clapp from Minneapolis, my next in command, was a great and inestimable service to me through his willingness and trustworthiness. I don't think I could have got along without him. Christmas dinner was a real victory feast, and I utilized the big cutting room of the cigar factory as a barracks hall or a banquet hall, decorated it with evergreens and a large Christmas tree at one end, resplendent with candles and glass ornaments dug up out of the attics of the of the populace. January 7th, we were notified of the death of ex-President Theodore Roosevelt. And in honor of his memory, the troops were turned out for a ceremony. They were lined up in the streets and stood at attention while I fired a salute of 21 rounds. Fortunately, I put two guns on the line. We fired blanks into a sand hill, but number one gun went out of action after the first round. Second gun took it up, and I did a little cold sweat that something might happen to that too, but fortunately we did get through with it, and I still have the shell case. With the latter part of March, I was taken with a attack of influenza and hurriedly sent to their field. But Ace Hospital at Mayan with a high temperature. I was escorted on the way by Miss Elsie Bird, the YMCA girl from Plainfield, New Jersey. And I was happy to have her along. My stay here was rather uneventful, except that I was told every morning how many soldiers or men had died the day before. One morning during my recovery, I noticed the familiar red guidon proceeding north, and I soon found out that our division was moving over to take up the sector which had been occupied by the 42nd Division. I was worried that they would go on without me, and I didn't want this to happen. So I walked out the front door, forgetting to check out, and hailed a passing motorcycle sidecar, and the driver took me back to Kaiser's Esch, where I was welcomed because it happened that the major was on leave, and I was put in command of the battalion. This was also a lucky break because that meant that when we arrived in the new area, I would be able to hand out the billeting areas among the three batteries very impartially. I selected the town of Ringen, which was just about a right size for one battery. Ringen was a small town and not far from Neuenahr on the Ahr River. The entirely a farming country. The farmers have their fields outside of the village, so that the village was a compact one, and nothing to indicate the farm other than the manure piles which were piled up in the courtyards, and which later on proved to be a little bit of a problem. I was a town commander and military commander. I was able to issue the regulations which I thought were necessary. At one time I asked that all materiel which had been left by the 42nd Division with the populace be brought out to the village square, which was done. Miscellaneous stuff which amounted to nothing, except one poor lady had brought a wheelbarrow full of Saturday Evening Post, which I told her were not really of military value. This account is continued on the Gazette.